The Notebook on Cities and Culture mailing list fires off regular updates about the show, and you, my friends, can subscribe. Visit colinmarshall.org and click Mailing List in the upper right column for details. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. And this is the first time I've been in Japan, but for the longest time I thought to myself, to see a certain kind of gaming done, you really have to go to Japan. How correct would I be in assuming that?
Well, I think especially with arcade gaming, that if you want to see that kind of in its element, in its natural element, you have to come to Japan. I mean, of course, you can play arcade games in other countries, and even in other countries, it's it continues to thrive to a certain extent, but in Japan, you're really seeing it in its kind of native, natural state.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking here today in Osaka with Brian Ashcraft, who writes he's actually the senior contributing editor at the video game site Kotaku. He has been a contributing editor at Wired magazine, and as well, he's written 2 books, Japanese Schoolgirl Confidential and Arcade Mania. Now, Brian, by the way, where are we sitting right now in Osaka? What's this neighborhood? It's farther north than I've been, I think.
Right now we're in Senri-Chūō, and kind of the interesting thing about Osaka is that it's kind of divided into north and south. And when people talk about real Osaka, they're speaking about South Osaka. And this area was really built up heavily during the 1970 World Expo. And this whole area was kind of developed for that. And in many ways, it's because of that, it's greener, and it's not like a mass of concrete in the same way that South Osaka is, and it's planned a little better for people to live. So that's kind of the huge distinctions. Where South Osaka, I mean, that area is kind of a jumble of houses and businesses and people, and it's an area that, I mean, it was largely bombed flat during the war. So when they rebuilt it got even more compact, especially in the years following the war. So that's kind of the big difference. And I really like the north area of the city. I think it's really pretty. There are lots of trees. This probably might sound somewhat rude, but it's maybe slightly more genteel than the south part of the city. But when I first came to Osaka, that's where I lived. I lived in the south part of the city, and I lived there for a while. And I really like it. I like going there, and I think culturally it's really, really interesting. And I do like it. I have a soft place in my heart for it.
Genteel is probably the last word a Japanese person outside Osaka would use to describe Osaka, right? That's like the opposite of its reputation in the rest of Japan?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird because if you're going to put it in the context of Japan, when people go to Tokyo, they generally try to speak in the Tokyo dialect, and they try to mold themselves to fit into Tokyo. When people from Kansai go to Tokyo, they continue to speak in the Kansai or the Osaka or Kobe dialect. So people kind of have this attitude that people from Osaka want you to know that they're from Osaka, and they will kind of remind you of that. And the reputation that the stereotype is that people from Osaka are very loud and they're very brash, and so that's why some people might think that. And the other thing is that usually when comedians, most of the comedians on television, speak in the Kansai dialect, so there's that kind of mingled in with the reputation as well. So for some reason, people outside of the city have this kind of, I don't know, this preconceived notion of people from Osaka, whereas people from Osaka think, people who live in Tokyo are utterly boring and dull. And so it's kind of an East Coast, West Coast rivalry kind of thing.
It's a little like you see a New York or a Chicago and like really play up their accent in the States when they leave their cities. When they say go to the West Coast, they really want you to know where they're from. I heart NY.
Right, exactly. And it's kind of the same thing. I mean, some people, New Yorkers are lovely people. And if you spend any time in New York, it's a great city and people there are wonderful. But, there's this kind of reputation that they have outside of New York. And it's kind of maybe similar for the people in Osaka.
Now, where is the arcade gaming to be done in Osaka?
Well, there's lots of places you can go. And sometimes it's a lot of local places. I guess if you're going to go to some of the larger arcades, you're going to have to go south. There's a really, really great arcade in Nipponbashi that I really like going to. But when I lived in the city, I would just often go to the Sega arcade that was kind of close to my house, and I could just kind of pop in and play, games that I really, really wanted to play for 50 yen a go. And it was great. It was really, really great. So you don't have to go extremely far to go play arcade games unless you live in the suburbs. And what's kind of happened is that in the suburbs that a lot of the arcades that exist are more of kind of like focused around crane games or kind of large deluxe kind of cabinets, like driving games, stuff like that. So if you want to play, Ikaruga or something like that, you probably shit out of luck. So that's kind of the big difference. If you live in the city, you should not have tremendous difficulty in finding an arcade that's really good and that has a lot of great games. That being said, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there were many more arcades. There were even more. It was much, much easier to go play arcade games, and that was just kind of what the situation for gaming was like at that time. It's changed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. It has changed, but it still exists, and companies continue to make games, really great arcade games. So that's something that's I think of comfort for people who really, really like arcade.
Now, back in our homeland, arcades have pretty much burned out other than the sort of bar/arcade concept in certain cities. Here, I mean, they may have had a reduction, but they're certainly not to the extent that they have in the United States. What's the difference in the gaming culture?
Well, it's funny. It's arcade gaming in the United States was always kind of centered around alcohol from its inception. I mean, they started opening these arcades in bars, and because of that, there's been a long historic link between playing arcade games and drinking alcohol. Whereas in Japan, arcade games really started in coffee shops. So you had the kind of the connection between alcohol never really existed. It was more of a connection between, I guess, drinking coffee or drinking tea.
In your book, there's that picture in the 70s, I guess, of them all leaning over the flat, I don't know what you call those, the flat cabinets you look down into with the milk tea, like precariously balancing on the Donkey Kong cabinet.
Right, exactly. And it's... So for me personally, when I think of like American arcade gaming, the kind of the mental picture that I get is, would be people throwing back a few beers and playing an arcade game. And I think that that's just kind of what arcade gaming is for America. If I was thinking about what arcade gaming would be for Japan, it would be today it would be somebody drinking like canned coffee and smoking a cigarette and then playing whatever game. And that just seems kind of the natural evolution of how they evolved in both of these cultures. And it's something that's very different. And so because of that, barcades, they might seem like a gimmick. People might think like, oh, here's, they have beer and old arcade games, how gimmicky. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think, if anything, they're probably the most accurate representation of arcade gaming in North America. And because of that, I think that they're absolutely wonderful. And the few arcades that I have been in the States, I don't get to the States that much, but the ones that I have gone to in the States, they've just been fantastic. And I I'm happy to see that they've caught on to a certain degree, and I think they're just great.
Shout out to Ground Control Barcade in Portland and Blipsies in Los Angeles. But in your book Arcade Mania, you talk about Osaka as having been the headquarters of some pretty famous game manufacturers like Capcom and SNK. Is there like a heritage of game production here?
Oh yeah, I mean Osaka has a long, proud history of obviously of making video games, and for a long time Konami was based in Kobe, and Konami has since after the Great Hanshin earthquake they moved to Tokyo. So there's always been, and then of course you have just an hour or so away you have Nintendo in Kyoto. So there's obviously a long, proud history in Western Japan for making games, and I really have kind of a soft spot in my heart for a lot of those arcade games that came out of Osaka in the 80s and 90s, because that was stuff that I grew up playing.
Well, what were your main games that really got you gaming?
Well, I mean, I remember playing Atari games as a kid, and we had a Magnavox Odyssey at home. So there, I mean, that was always kind of around. And I think my dad might have had a Pong set, but I don't ever really remember hooking it up or playing it, other than maybe once or twice trying to figure out what it was.
They weren't easy to hook up,
right. But I do remember that when I was, I guess it was 6 or 7, that my parents got me an NES for Christmas. That first Christmas when it came out, and I just remember being incredibly impressed by it. And I think that probably is true of anyone who grew up in the 1980s. I don't think that's unusual at all. I think that if you didn't have an NES, you're probably a little weird.
Right. The NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, to spell it out, formed. It really did form a generation here, and it was a neat thing in America, certainly. But you describe in your book in Japan, the Famicom, as was known here, was pretty much a revelation that you can play these games at home. Like the impact was even bigger in Japan, seems like.
Well, I mean, they had kind of like plug and plays before, and Nintendo was making plug and plays. But I think that the thing that really kind of hit home in Japan was that it was. I can't really think of another product that really sums up the 1980s in Japan as nicely and succinctly as the Family Computer did for Japan. It was high-tech, it was a lot of fun, and it exploded all over pop culture. So I think, if anything, that really kind of is a good way to mark that decade. And it was huge. It was obviously huge in Japan, and it's funny. Like yesterday, I went to my son's I guess it would be parent-teacher day, or where you go to class and you watch the kids what they do in school, for like a period or something.
Is this a Japan-only thing?
No. I mean, this would be like in the U.S., like your parents come to school and they watch, and then it's like, oh, this is how the kids study, or this is what they do at school. So the period the class that I was watching was, I guess, the Japanese language class. And they were trying to describe something, and the teacher, was able to weave in, a Super Mario reference. And it didn't seem like it was like she was trying to reach, I'm speaking the same lingo that these little kids are, and I'm cool, da-da-da-da-da. It was just kind of a cultural marker that if the teacher was able to use this explanation, that kids would be able to understand it. And so I just remember sitting there thinking, it's like, wow, that's kind of like where... That's really what it means. And I don't think it's what it necessarily just means for Japan. I mean, I'd say that I'd be willing to kind of move that needle and say, well, it probably means the same thing for the rest of the world. But the fact that it's such a cultural shorthand in Japan still, that sometimes you'll hear comedians kind of make quips on television. It's like, oh, it's like this in Mario, or something like that. And it's not like somebody, it's like, oh, I'm a gamer being hip or whatever. It's like, this is kind of a defining thing for a generation of people and for this country. And so when you meet people in Japan, and the thing that always is, I think, surprises a lot of them is that I don't think everyone's like this, but there are people who seem to be unaware of how large the cultural impact for this is outside of the country. There's like, oh, wow, you had a Nintendo 2 when you were growing up. You know, it's like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Oh, you play that game as well. Wow, I had no idea, you know. So I think that's one of the really interesting thing. And the great thing about video games in Japan is that for so many people, it becomes kind of something that will enable you to leap any sort of cultural barrier. It's like, oh, I grew up playing that as well. It was called this and this and this, but it's the same game. And they're like, oh, wow. And so you have that, there's that common bond immediately where it's like, oh, then I guess we're really not that different. And our childhoods weren't that different, you know.
You mentioned the Famicom defining a decade of the decade of the 80s here in Japan, and I remember growing up, I was even then into games that were older, I guess would have been considered retro games even then, and I would talk to Japanese people and they would say things like, well, you know, in Japan we don't really care about the old stuff anymore, but reading your book and talking to you, it seems like at least retro gaming is a thing in Japan now. Maybe it has always been. Maybe I was just lied to before. Right. But people, in certain segments, they do care about the older games here, right?
Right. I mean, with anything in Japan, anything that can be collected or bought and sold, there will always be kind of a niche market for whatever. So there are people who are willing to pay, insane prices for old Ultraman figures, you know what I mean, or old monster movie figures, whatever. So that exists in Japan as well. And the same thing goes for old video games. I mean, if you walk around, Akihabara or Nipponbashi, you can see plenty of stores that specialize in selling old video games, and then people who buy the old console or probably already have the old consoles and then buy the old games and they want to play them on those machines. It's in a way, it's become kind of the video game equivalent of people who still buy records.
Oh, yes.
Do you know?
Which there are even more today than ever, in the last 20 years anyway.
Exactly, and it's like, and if you like, I love records. I buy records. So if you're buying a record, you get a very different feeling from buying something off iTunes. And people say, well, the sound quality is different, and you're able to, record at different levels, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But I'm just talking about the physical sensation of buying it, of flipping through, LP albums and hearing that kind of that
the hunt, the thrill of the hunt.
Yeah. And so you just hearing that noise. And the same thing is like when you walk into a retro game store and you see all of these old games, that same kind of feeling of discovery and then being able to get that physical object. So I think that still very much exists in Japan. I think that the good thing is that a lot of people took excellent care of the games that they owned, so that has kind of enabled this secondhand market to thrive or to continue to exist. So I don't think people buying old video games is mainstream in Japan, in the sense that I don't think that the majority of the population is doing it, but I think there are enough people doing it that it does lead to the subculture where you have like retro game bars, or you even have, like I just said, lots of retro game shops.
Is it fair to say that video game culture reaches many more people in Japan than it does in the States? Like when you're writing about video game culture, you can write about more of Japan than you could write about the States. Say if you were writing about gaming there you're writing about a specific subculture. Here,
right.
Most people maybe have some point of contact with the gaming.
Right. Well, so kind of an interesting thing is like, if you're going to write about a Japanese celebrity, you can probably find a point in their career where they have either promoted a game, appeared at some sort of game event, or have, appeared in a game ad or something, and that goes for the vast majority of celebrities. So that's kind of the big difference between the U.S., I don't think you can't do that. If you're writing about somebody famous, probably the chances that they haven't been really involved with video games in the same way that they have in Japan.
Right. If you're writing about, Harrison Ford, he probably hasn't. Maybe he's been in the Japanese game commercial, but he's not played a game in the United States ever.
Right. Well, yeah. So it's like if like for example, let's say you're going to write about the most famous American comedian, or some of the most famous American comedians. Probably their contact with video games will have been extremely limited. However, if you're going to write about pretty much any famous Japanese comedian, they've probably either done a Nintendo ad or they've done something with video games that there's that instant connection.
The convergence of the games industry and sort of the comedy proving ground that Osaka is that? I mean, you mentioned comedians a couple times in association with games. Is that a fruitful overlap of cultures in Osaka, with the comedy and games?
I don't know if there's a direct connection between, for example, Osaka comedians and games, but I do know that there tends to be a direct connection between how popular a comedian is and then how many commercials that they appear in, and then that translates into probably promoting a video game. Like, here's just kind of an easy example. A few years ago, two comedians that are known as Audrey, they became really, really popular, and so then they started doing like Nintendo ads. It just was kind of like a logical thing. So if somebody becomes popular, then they'll probably appear in like a smattering of commercials. One of those commercials is probably going to be a video game commercial. Like, it ends up being like law of averages, you know what I mean? So sooner or later, they'll be either promoting Monster Hunter or some Nintendo game or whatever. And, I think that that's kind of great because some of the commercials have been like fantastic. There's like the Hot Mario ads. They're a few years old, but the group of comedians is known as 99. And they're hot Mario ads. Like, even today, like, I can watch some of those like ads from a few years ago, and they continue. Like, one of the comedians, his name is Okamura, and he plays a bunch of foreigners like playing Mario Kart in one of the ads, and he goes, "Oh man, come on!" And this is like it's like some biker guy at a bar.
I haven't even seen it. I'm laughing at it now.
It's brilliant. So it's a great ad. But yeah, so you can usually see them on television. So,
in your personal set of interests, which came first, Japan or video games?
Video games have always kind of, I mean, they've always just been around, and so, as I said earlier, if you grew up in the 80s, you were playing Japanese video games, and you were probably also watching Japanese cartoons, but you didn't know that they were Japanese cartoons, that they'd been re-edited, and you're even probably playing with Japanese toys, and you weren't aware that they were Japanese toys.
Robotech was Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of, if I go through the list of things that I kind of grew up on, and I compare them to, like, any of my friends here, it's like there's so much crossover, it becomes kind of astounding. And, but, when I was a little kid, there was one of our neighbors was and is a flight attendant, and she flies Dallas to Tokyo, and so every time she would come back, she would bring like either snacks from Japan, or they had she had like this old pachinko machine in her house, and she would bring like cans of Coke, and at that time the cans of Coke were different. They were different shape. They were kind of these thin, cylindrical, long things that were different. And
as a kid, just that's from Bizarro World.
Yeah, it's like wow, it's totally shaped different, and it's like it even tastes a little different. You would it probably tasted the same, but you would tell yourself that. So that was always kind of around, and the other thing that really kind of stuck with me is I remember as a kid, like when I was maybe in third grade or something, we had a class trip because we had like some foreign exchange students from Japan, so we all went to a Japanese restaurant, and it was like the food was totally different from anything that I'd ever had. It really kind of like blew my mind. So I was like, wow, this food tastes really good. It's really different. I've never quite seen food like this. And, you have to use chopsticks to eat them. So it just seemed very, very interesting to me. And then, like I befriended one of those foreign exchange students, and I remember like once going to his house, and he had a Famicom in his house.
Oh yes.
And it was totally different from the video consoles that they were selling in America. And I just remember like looking at it and being like, it's like, wow, this is really different. You know what I mean? And I remember like the first time that I went to his house, or the first time he came to my house, his parents, like, they gave us like my parents like a scarf. And it was like kind of, I guess, my first introduction into this country's like gift giving culture. And I just remember like, it's like, wow, he's just coming over to play. It's like, we don't need, do you know what I mean? And it's like, even...
We don't do this here.
even I think by Japanese standards, that was probably a little excessive. You'd probably just give him like, here's some cookies or something, you know what I mean? But it just kind of, something like that just really, really struck me. So, and then for a while, I was like trying to even follow like Japanese baseball. I was like, wow, this country has basebal as well. I love baseball.
Boy, does it ever have baseball.
Yeah.
I mean, you're in Osaka. It's
Yeah.
a Tigers country.
Yeah. So it was just like, wow, this place seems so interesting. So, when I was, living in Los Angeles, the company that I was working for distributed movies. And, the boss of that company, the guy who ran the company, was trying to get, and he loved Japan. I mean, he loved Japanese movies, and he loved sumo. I mean, he still loves, huge sumo fan. And so he was trying to get the rights to the Kenji Fukusaka film Battles Without Honor and Humanity to release in the U.S. And I just remember him going to Japan and how kind of, him coming back and talking about it. It's like, I really need to go. And so it was just kind of all of that combined. And I ended up coming to Japan, and I first went to Tokyo, and I didn't like it very much. And then I came to Osaka, and I was like, oh, wow, this is a really nice place. I could live here. This seems like an easy place to live.
What was the difference? Was Tokyo just too Tokyo?
I don't know. It's just, I mean, it's like one of those things. Even now when I go to Tokyo a lot for work. Even when I go there, it just doesn't, it doesn't feel like my town. You know what I mean? So I don't know what it is. I mean, I just kind of felt immediate connection with Osaka, and it's like, I really like the city a lot. I like, because I've lived in Osaka pretty much the entire time that I've been in Japan, the language that people speak that sounds like like real Japanese, their pronunciation, their accent, just the dialect. I mean, that's, for me, that's Japanese. So when I go to Tokyo, which, I mean, obviously it's Japanese as well, you can't slight it. I mean, that's the standardized language. It just seems a little different. It seems to be honest, it seems slightly foreign. And so, like, whenever I come back to Osaka and I'm at Shinosaka Station, it's like, oh, I'm home. And people start standing on the other side of the escalator. You start hearing the dialect, and you're like, oh, I'm back, So I don't know what it was. And then I probably wasn't that, obviously I wasn't that attuned to it because I didn't really understand the language, and I just kind of just was like showing up. But it's just a feeling that I had. It's like Tokyo's a huge, Osaka's a huge city, Tokyo's a huge city. It felt slightly impersonal, where, it's like, I just found it really easy to kind of meet people in Osaka. People come up to you and start talking, and pretty easy to make friends. And then being in Tokyo, because Tokyo is a city of strangers, right? So it's people from all over the country assembled in this one city. So there's less of this kind of family type atmosphere, I guess. I don't know exactly.
Well, you describe a certain, comfort here, and I wonder when you realized you could not only live in Japan, but become a part of Japan as much as a Westerner can. I mean, when did you realize this was a place you could actually be, like your life could be in Japan? When did you realize that was a viable prospect? It's weird. It's like when you, for me personally, the first 2 years living in Japan were very, very stressful. In the sense that, for me personally, I just didn't feel quite comfortable with the language.
I wasn't used to speaking it. I just remember, like, especially the first year, I just remember, like, once sitting on the train and everyone around you is, like, talking and having fun, and you have no idea what the hell that they're saying. And it just felt just very I just felt very isolated. I mean, I liked the country a lot and I wanted to stay here, but it for a while, I mean, especially in that first year, it felt like it was, okay, like, oh, I'm in Japan. Like, you were constantly reminded of that. I don't know if there was a specific moment where, I mean, I do remember, like, once I was like I was watching a Battle Royale. Yes. And this is kind of weird.
Popular Japanese movie in the States.
Right. So I was watching Battle Royale, and maybe I'd been here for like a year or something, and it's like, I remember watching it, and the thing is, I'd met the director, and like, before he died, and I had been a huge fan of his work. And when I'd seen his movies before, it's like I couldn't understand anything. And so here I am, like, in this like crappy apartment watching Battle Royale, and it's like, oh, I can kind of understand. I can understand what they're saying, you know. And it's not only that; it's like I know kind of what these words mean. I know kind of the weight behind them, and so
the feel for language, the sprachgefühl, as Germans say.
Right? Yeah. So you kind of it's like oh, okay. So I can kind of feel it now. So, I mean, there were a lot of little instances like that kind of, built up over time. And now it's like, it's kind of, I've been here for so long. And it's like, now when I go back to the States, I'm like, it's like, oh, wow, I'm in America. It's like, oh, there are Americans everywhere, you know?
What strikes you as odd about the States now that you have been Japanified to some extent?
Well, it's funny. It's I grew up in Texas, and for a long time, I did not like living in Texas. And I did not like Texas. And I did not like the culture. And I just...
None of this you can say while you're there, of course. You've got to seem like you love Texas.
Yeah, otherwise you'd be surrounded by a mob of proud Texans. And I think it's one of the reasons why I decided to go to University of New York. So, but I'm in Japan for a while, and suddenly it's like hey, I want to start listening to like Willie Nelson. I'm started really getting into country music, something that I'd always abhorred, that I just thought was just like, it's like that's so Texas, so Southern, and I just don't like it.
It would have been too easy had you stayed in Texas to like that stuff. There's no effort. It's the default.
It is. That's exactly. It's the default. So, it took me coming to Japan to really, really appreciate it. So now every time I go back to Texas, I always want to do really, really Texan things like let's go look at boots, let's go buy hats, Right. People in Texas don't do that, I mean, some people obviously they buy boots and buy hats, but I mean most people it's like the rest of the country. But became very, very interested in Texas history and all this kind of stuff, and so whenever I go back, I love traveling around the state, and I'm just very, very interested in it. I interviewed once this very famous Japanese industrial designer, and he was saying that it took, and he lived in San Francisco for several years, and he said living in San Francisco taught him more about Japan than ever living in Japan. And I feel the same way. It's like every year that I live in Japan, America does move one further step away, and Japan moves one step closer. That's just natural. And Japan just continues to feel more and more comfortable, more and more like home. It's just everything is completely normal now. Nothing is like, wow, what's that? What are they doing? It's completely gone. Where it's just like, oh, this is what people do, blah 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 blah. But I do feel that I've learned a lot about the States living here. I've learned a lot about growing up in Texas, growing up in this, the Southwest, which is kind of strange. I don't think I ever would have expected that to happen. So, and it especially because I have two kids as well. I always want to make sure that they know about American stuff. I mean, I think for them it all probably seems somewhat strange and somewhat foreign to them. but just to make sure that at least they were kind of vaguely aware of this kind of stuff.
So there's some sense in which, though, you'd like it if they could sort of have more of a foot in American culture than kids who have two Japanese parents. You know what I mean? Like you'd like it if they were well versed in America.
Right. Well, I don't even think it's. I mean, this may sound like utterly superficial, but it's the kind of things that I want them to be exposed to are, not just kind of cultural stuff. Well, I guess if you're going to say that mass media or art is, I mean, that's an extension of culture. That's really what I really want them to be aware of. Like that, this is the kind of stuff. I want them to know about. For example, I just said country music, so this is Merle Haggard, that kind of stuff. This is Johnny Cash, but also to. This is jazz, this is George Gershwin, this is, American art, this is Roy Lichtenstein, this is, that kind of stuff. This is Andy Warhol, this is Jackson Pollock, that kind of stuff as well. So, I think that kind of the knock against sometimes, the knock that people put against America is often like, oh, American culture is just, hamburgers and Hollywood movies, which is completely false. Just so that they're aware of this other kind of, this wonderful American culture and history and stuff like that. But at the same extension, by the same merit or whatever, I do know, I do understand the limitations of that, and that, for a while it kind of pained me. It's like, I was like, oh wow, my kids. Everyone speaks Japanese at home. So my son, he can kind of read English, and whenever he goes to America and tries to talk to his grandparents, it's like, I'm good, I'm okay, thank you. I mean, just really kind of basic stuff. And so that's
the same way that I speak Japanese.
Right, yeah. And I know how he interacts with his grandparents here, so that to a certain degree that always makes me somewhat sad, because I know that he can't have those deeper conversations. So, I mean, that always, to be honest, that saddens me somewhat.
But it's not impossible that they could, learn English well enough. I meet Japanese people all the time who speak good English. They live abroad for a period usually, but
right. And I mean, we've been doing stuff to kind of hopefully help him develop that closer connection. I mean, like, he sometimes goes to the States for extended period of time and stuff. And so my parents, I think, are also very. I think they've been incredibly open about the entire situation, and they haven't, they've been incredibly understanding, and they always love it when we come to visit, and there's never been any problems on their end. But I do wish that and I'm probably the one to blame, because we're all speaking Japanese at home. So.
But it's gotten you pretty good at Japanese, I would imagine. Yeah. If it's like, I can't talk to my kids unless I can speak Japanese, you're going to speak damn good Japanese.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like and that was the other thing that, I mean, when you're, I know people who, friends of mine who maybe their father or their mother was a foreigner, and they can speak perfect English, and, they can speak perfect Japanese, and they're well-adjusted people. The concern that maybe I had personally was, it's like, I don't want my kids to ever have some sort of moment where they have a complex about having a strange last name and a foreign father. So, and I just remember, like, growing up in America, it's like there would be a lot of my friends who maybe their parents were from Greece or from China or whatever, and they couldn't really speak their parents' language. But they still were very aware of that heritage, but they were completely American.
Yeah, it's like in America, you meet a sort of you meet a Billy Fujikawa pretty often, right? You know what I mean? Like that's America. It's people from everywhere,
and that they have this different kind of, maybe their parents came from somewhere else or a different background. But I mean, there's no denying, especially when you go back to America, you become far more attuned to this. It's like, wow, so there's all these different kinds of people, but they're all Americans. I mean, they all talk and act and move and think and eat like Americans. So,
sure.
So kind of maybe my reaction or whatever for for the kid was, I don't ever want him to have a moment where it's like he questions whether or not he's Japanese. The kid's Japanese. He grew up here. He's growing up here. He goes to public school here. That's his language. He eats Japanese food all day. And because of that, I want him to be really, really good at his own language. And I say this just as someone who makes a living using his, my own language. So that was really important to me. So we've want him to do he's really good at calligraphy and all this other kind of stuff. So kind of the attitude was like, I don't want him to kind of half-ass his own language, I guess. And because of that, maybe there's been obviously, and not just saying that people, a lot of people who grow up bilingual, it's not saying that they half-ass one language or the other. Some people are able to do both of them 100%. But that was just kind of the feeling. And maybe because of that, his English might have suffered somewhat, but I always feel like he can learn it. It's something that he hears on a regular basis, because I do try to talk to him in English. He just tends to answer everything in Japanese. So yeah, there is that element. So,
and there's some sense in which, I would say it's 2012 and not 1948. Not so strange in Japan to have an international heritage, is it anymore? Or, obviously you look around and you can see that it's not common, but it's not like what are you?
Right. Well, it's weird because, I think that even within the last 10 years, I've noticed kind of a sea change where you'll see more and more kids of mixed back, and not just like one father is from Europe or America, or one mother is from, somewhere in the West, and the other parent is Japanese. But, there are a lot of kids who maybe one parent is Chinese or Korean or whatever. So, in my kids' school, there are other kids of mixed backgrounds as well. And for a long time, especially if one parent was Chinese or Korean, that was kind of hidden. And I think that people are gradually becoming, maybe not so much now because tensions between Japan and China and Korea are not so good.
Sure.
But until recently, maybe people were a little more open about it. And so I think that that's good. I think that multiculturalism in Japan is still very different from multiculturalism in other countries, because the vast majority of people don't have experience with it. And the experience that they have with people of different backgrounds is not kind of like eating and living with them. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
It's more, maybe they have interacted with foreigners through work or from learning a foreign language, or maybe they've befriended them or something. I don't know. For a lot of people, there still might be a line or something that it's, but like I said, it is changing. And I think that even within the last 10 years, you see more and more kind of people of mixed background on television, people with, like, my kids have a strange last name, people with strange last names. So that's becoming more and more normal. That being said, sometimes, you'll call and order a pizza and you'll say that, that you'll say your last name and they'll be like, what is that, a company or something? And you're like,
what is the Japanese pronunciation of your last name?
Ashcraft.
That's not so bad.
Yeah, but you get Ashu-san. Everyone thinks it'll be like, it's like Ashu is your last name, the last name, and then Crafto is your first name, and then Brian is something else. I don't know. So that's kind of, because Ash is like Ashu's. That's like, it's kind of somewhat of a common, like, I don't want to say it's a common word in Japanese, but there have been like books that have used it, or it has appeared in the language. So.
You mentioned your son having found some elements of American culture perhaps a bit strange, and you talk about your growing up getting into Japan, and I think of my own time as well, with Japanese snacks looking a little bit strange, and cartoons and commercials especially were always held up like, look at these wacky Japanese commercials. But you've been here well over a decade, and even in the short time that I've been staying here, and the what I've learned about Japan over the years, I mean, it seems to me Japan is many things, but it's not weird, is it?
I don't think so at all. And I think that that's one of the things that when people don't have the proper context, or if they don't understand why something is like it is, and they are left only with an image, then kind of the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people, a lot of Westerners, is to kind of pull back and say, "Oh, that's just strange. I don't get it." But if you take the time to explain something and say, like, this is why it's like this, that people end up often being much more open and much more willing to kind of understand or try to understand whatever it is you're talking about. The problem has always been that a lot of people who I mean, in the past, this has changed, but in the past, a lot of people who wrote about Japanese in English didn't speak the language.
Right.
And
sort of like a Ruth Benedict, if you go back far enough, but there was that distance.
Right, yeah. It's just like it was enough to be a foreigner, and then that was it, and then the next layer is that understanding the history or the culture or where people are coming from, why people think this or why they're doing this. And without those kind of 2 or 3 different layers, when you're talking about something, you lose all nuance, which doesn't help in explaining it, and then kind of the default ends up being like, well, that's just weird, or that's just the way people are, or it's like this. And you just want to say, like, well, wait a minute, there's much more going on than that. And then there's also, like, the thing that helps me most about going back to the States is that it puts me in the mindset of people in the States reading about Japan. So when I'm back in the States, it's like, oh, it's like this. It's like this here. So when I'm writing about that, I need to be careful to explain it.
Like when you're writing on Kotaku on a daily basis, you're interpreting elements of Japanese gaming culture and other elements of the culture, on the net. Just quick, you're getting it up. You're doing this. You're doing all this interpretation pretty quickly. What are the considerations and the challenges for making sure someone in the States or elsewhere? What do you keep in mind to make sure it's like, oh, I have to explain this. They have to know this. They don't know this. Like, what's at the top of your mind as far as quickly parsing the sort of cultural differences when you need to report on something, neat or shocking or funny?
Right. Well, I think that if it's something pretty straightforward, like if it's pretty much basic video game news, then it everyone already speaks that language. So you can kind of just dive in and say, like, oh, this is this is, that. But if it's something that requires some more sensitivity, then you really have to kind of either put it in kind of a historical context and then transfer that over to, it's like, oh, people will understand it if it's like this, So, yeah, it's just a matter of, like, making sure that you find that nuance to explain something. So it's like, it's the same thing. It's like whenever, like, for example, I was watching the news last night, and there was some guy, some commentator talking about the election in the U.S. and describing what was happening. And I'm just like throwing something at the television because he's like, every bit of nuance about the election in the U.S. and what it means and all this other stuff was completely lost.
Oh, my God.
Because the guy was explaining something in very kind of, it's like, well, this and this and this, so it's like this, And it's like, if you were to put that all in English, I mean, I'm not even talking about what people's political affiliation is. I'm not, saying that, like, he was saying that this candidate is better than that candidate or whatever. The fact that it was kind of in these very sweeping kind of general terms, and like people are like, oh, okay, the news anchor was like, oh, okay, now we all understand, kind of thing. Like, I'm pretty much like in my mind waving my hands in front of the television trying to get everyone to stop and say, like, wait a minute, you're missing this. And if there were Americans talking about this, no matter what if they were serious political commentators on either side of the aisle, they would bring up these different points, and those they didn't exist. Because it was more or less, we need to put this, we have 2 minutes, and we need to put this in an easy way for people in this country to understand so that they can so the election is this,
Right.
So by that same token, when I'm explaining something to, whatever it is, if I'm talking about something for people who don't live in this country, I have to make sure that those same nuances, it's people don't really do this, or it's not like this. This is a very small group of people that are doing this, whatever it is, but just make sure that that's in there so nobody feels like they're being misled or something is being unfair. And I think in the past 10 years, reporting about Japan, because there are more and more people who've lived here who understand the culture, I think it has gotten better and better and better. Especially if you compare to stuff that you'd hear in the early 00s and stuff in the 90s that you'd hear about this country. It just was often ludicrous, It
would always be a caricature.
Yeah, I mean, it would be I remember I was once in Los Angeles, and this guy who wasn't in the company that I worked for, he was in the neighboring studio, and he was I'm going to write this movie about this used panty vending machine something.
The core was the used panty vending machine.
And this was in 1996, 1997, and that was kind of the central crux of his idea for a movie. Right. And then, so he told my boss was going to Japan, he's can you ask people about that? And, we had the internet then, but it wasn't the internet now, And so my boss went and he asked some people, and he came back and he was dude, nobody knew what the fuck you're talking about. Nobody had any clue.
Yeah. I remember those would be held up for a while. For years there, they would say, Japan, that's where they have the used schoolgirl panty vending machines. You'd think they were everywhere, but I assure you, listeners, I haven't seen a one.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's an urban legend, and there's
this is a sort of razor blade in the Halloween apple thing where there's really no examples of it.
Where it's I'm sure that there were one or two of them somewhere, because somebody, there's pictures of them where it's somebody took an old cigarette vending machine and they stuck that in, and then they put that in an adult store, right. But this notion that they were on every corner, and then it was this somebody did is they conflated the used garment trade, which did exist, into vending machines for some sort of Western kind of perfect storm of Japanese fetishization. So, I just remember that having kind of a very profound effect on me when my boss came back and said, dude, this doesn't exist. And the thing that really, really, really stuck with me about working at that company was that the company would release kind of a lot of, they would either release blaxploitation movies or, kind of they released a Hong Kong monster movie, and kind of movies that a lot of people would, a lot of kind of say film snobs would kind of look at and just immediately turn their nose up. Right. And I think the thing that really kind of stuck with me was that I just remember my boss saying, that just because something isn't directed by Fellini, or something like that, doesn't mean that it's not a great work of art, and doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve the utmost seriousness in how you approach it. And that doesn't mean you can't have fun with it and enjoy discussing whatever. And you have to be all dour and really boring. It just means that you need to give something the proper respect that it deserves. And one of the movies that the company released was this Italian horror movie called The Beyond, and the director of it was Fulci, Lucio Fulci, and they had for the DVD box set one of his last interviews, and. It was kind of filmed on with the VHS cameras. The camera quality was really bad, and I think he might have been speaking in English with he had a really, really heavy accent, and the company that was going not the distribution company, but the main company wanted to actually, I think, cut that or didn't want to include it. And one of the guys that we were working on the release with, this guy named Bob, and he also edited The Hurt Locker. He got an Oscar for that. He was saying, he's like, how dare that they say that they would want to cut this? If this was like an interview with Fellini, they would never say that, And this guy is a great filmmaker, and just because he made, he didn't say this, but kind of the implication was, just because he made these kind of really gross movies doesn't mean that they were anything that they didn't deserve to be looked at in a very earnest and serious way. So for me personally, whenever anything that I'm writing about, whether that's schoolgirls or video games or just even whatever, it doesn't matter, that the approach that I'll take is I want to look at something in a very kind of serious and earnest way and try to understand why something is the way it is. Why does this trend exist? What's the reason for it? When people here are into something, where are they coming from? Trying to kind of understand that, instead of just being like, oh, well,
it's weird, it's Japan, I don't know.
Yeah, or even just it's like not giving it the attention that it deserves. So.
Right. I'd put it this way. I was rereading bits and pieces of your book on Japanese Schoolgirls, Japanese Schoolgirl Confidential, on the train up from Mikuno this morning, and I was thinking this book is as much about, in some ways, what a Japanese schoolgirl isn't, clearing away some preconceptions, misconceptions in the Western mind. Then It's also about, of course, what they are. But you're clearing out a lot of brush, right? With anything you're writing about, you're sort of clearing away what's there and then rebuilding again. You think?
Right. Yeah. It's always funny with the schoolgirl book. It's like you can kind of tell by people's reaction or kind of the knee-jerk reaction before they actually read it what they've been exposed to.
Oh, yes.
So
it's like a Rorschach blot.
Yeah, exactly. So I found that a lot of non-Japanese females will go into very kind of an open mind. It's like, oh, okay, and just kind of don't have the preconceived notions. And then there's a percent, I don't want to say a large percentage, but some males, it's like their kind of default notion will revert to something like pornography, because that's kind of that's just kind of, we have the internet, and there are certain things on the internet, and if you spend any time on the internet, you're going to see some of these things. It doesn't mean that they were actively searching for them, but that just might be their kind of where they're coming from. So it's like this. So it's all sex, or they, people just want to have sex with them, or da 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 da.
In the West, that's the only place we know schoolgirl uniforms from. Here you see the actual people everywhere.
Right.
But there, it's just like it's just on the net.
Right. And so the thing that becomes is like for Japanese people, it's like when they see a schoolgirl, there are a myriad of meanings that'll have. For example, you may think of your sister, or your kid, that you may just, or that's just a student, you might have that reaction. If you're a woman, you might think of when you were that age, it's like, oh, that was when I was 16, 17, 18, and, I was kind of unfettered, and I didn't have huge responsibilities, and I was, a lot of women, if you talk to them, they'll say, it's like I was kind of, I was at my cutest, and then you'll also kind of get this notion that, then this kind of time period, or this kind of motif, or whatever, something that's very healthy, or something that's very, it's why you'll see schoolgirl characters pop up in health insurance commercials, or selling you sliced bread, or what I mean, where they're trying to sell something that's happy and healthy.
It's a wholesome image.
Wholesome, yeah, it's very wholesome. And then of course you will get some of the kind of seedier elements that aren't unique to this culture, that exist pretty much anywhere that there's a young woman in a uniform. It exists.
That knows no cultural boundaries.
Right. It exists in the West in different forms, and it exists here as well. But just the fact that it's kind of this multifaceted, and the fact that I was very curious to understand where different people were coming from, what it meant, and not just kind of fall back to it's like, oh well, it's because they're cute and people want to, people are thinking about sex. It's like, well, that's a gross oversimplification because it doesn't take into account like how children view them, or
they touch every part of society.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like it's this, like I just said, it's this multifaceted kind of iconography, which means different things to different people in different points in their life, and to kind of then use that as a way of not only understanding what that meant, but then a way of understanding Japan, and then tying it into Japanese history and kind of grounding it in that. And I think that's the kind of stuff that really, really interests me. I mean, I'm really, really interested, especially in the last century, how much this country has changed, how the war affected, and even to this day continues to impact this country. And it doesn't do it overtly, but it radically. I mean, if you look at pictures of Americans 100 years ago, they look different, but it's not like it's like, whoa, what's going on?
Right. They're the same size as Americans today.
If you look at pictures of Japanese people 100 years ago, you're like, wow, it's like it's very different. I mean, the place has changed, but then there's so much of it that hasn't changed. It's so much of it that is the same, and it's something that I mean, it's one of my really, really. It's one of the things I really love talking to elderly people about. I do talk to older people a lot, and I love hearing about what it was like before the war, what it was like during the war, what it was like in the years after the war. I think that's a fascinating time period, and the way that this country was able to kind of pick itself up by its bootstraps, move forward, rebuild, is something that I find to be inspiring.
I've been speaking here in Osaka, Japan with Brian Ashcraft. He is a senior contributing editor at the video game site Kotaku, author of Arcade Mania and Japanese Schoolgirl Confidential. Brian, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks.
And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Millman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.